everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of At the Boundary, the podcast from the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. I'm Jim Cardoso, Senior Director for GNSI and your host for At the Boundary. Today on the show, we're going to be exploring the history and current state of American intelligence. GNSI Senior Research Fellow Dr. Jeff Rogg recently published a new book, The Spy and the State, The History of American Intelligence. Jeff will join us to talk about this book in just a minute. A couple of quick notes first. Look for the next GNSI newsletter in your inbox this week. This issue will feature decision briefs on a variety of topics, including Golden Dome, the status of the Russia-Ukraine war, and a new one on BRICS. We'll also have a recap of last week's Transatlantic Forum on Cybersecurity, where we were joined by the University of Paris-Saclay and USF's Bellini College of AI, Cybersecurity, and Computing. We'll drop a link in the show notes to subscribe to our newsletter if you inexplicably haven't done so already. Also last week, we dropped the latest episode of our GNSI research initiative focused on the axis of resistance. It's the fifth episode in the series, with this conversation focused on Iraq. And in case you missed it, we published a special At the Boundary episode last week on the dynamic and literally explosive situation between Iran, Israel, and the U.S. You can find links to both shows in the show notes. All right, let's now talk with Dr. Jeff Rogg as he joins us in the studio. He's a senior research fellow at GNSI and one of the country's leading experts on intelligence history. His latest book, The Spy and the State, The History of American Intelligence, is a comprehensive dive into the American intelligence community. There's lots of names, dates, and locations in the book, but it's also filled with highly entertaining and enlightening stories that make it a deep but entertaining read. And it's our pleasure to have him on At the Boundary today. Jeff, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Jim, and it's really great to be here home at GNSI.
Yes, indeed. Here in Tampa. It's always good. You know, we do these podcasts, and it's always fun. We do them virtually with people, but it's always nice to have somebody in the studio sitting across the table from me that I know well as well. So we're going to have a good time with this. First of all, why did you write the book?
Absolutely. And, you know, there's something going on in intelligence every day. If you pick up the paper, if you look at your news feed, you can find intelligence in there. And so I always like to tell people I'm lucky and I love what I do because there's always something to talk about in intelligence. But besides that, you know, I'm a historian, so I'm going to make the argument all historians do, which is you really do have to learn from the past. And so as I wrote the book, I was thinking about what was going on in the present. You know, historians aren't supposed to admit that, and academics aren't, that, you know, we're presentists. That's sort of a slight for historians. But I believe that we're always shaped by our experiences. And so my history of American intelligence was very much influenced by intelligence events ongoing in the United States at the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we're going to spend, you know, the book is, it's an incredibly, it's just jam-packed. There's incredible information in there. So, I mean, if we were to go do a true book talk, it would be a series, you know, there'd be an anthology we put on Apple TV or something like that. But since we only got 30 minutes or so, we're going to focus on using the book, but also just kind of relating that to current events as well. But kind of looking at the book and the history, you know, there's an old saying, some ascribe to Einstein, but I think that's been disproven. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. And, you know, as I read this, the history of intelligence reflects that as the U.S. government has sought ways to coordinate and align the intelligence enterprise, it seems to take the same approach over and over with the benefit of hindsight, the same ineffective result. Can you talk to that?
Sure, absolutely. And I love that quote because it's very fitting for the history of American intelligence, especially one of the themes that you isolated. And, you know, so just as you noted, one of the things that I had to do as I wrote the book is, aside from tell entertaining stories, tell cool spy stories, you know, talk about hidden episodes in American intelligence history, is tie it together. And so coordination is one of those themes that ties the book together, or rather the lack thereof. We've always been trying to get the best information we can and bring it to policymakers so they can make decisions. But as we know from some of the big episodes, and I talk about them in the book, like Pearl Harbor or 9/11, the intelligence community is often accused of failing. And one of the failures is because they didn't coordinate what they had. The problem with that, though, is, you know, our intelligence community, notice what we call it, a community. meaning we don't call it a department. It's not under one department. There's not one real leader. And, we can talk about the DNI, or before that, the Director of Central Intelligence, the DCI. And so the issue that we have is the intelligence community is only as good, the coordination is only as good as the cooperation among many of its elements. And, you've worked in government, I've worked in government. How cooperative are they? Sometimes better than others. So one of the things that I mentioned in the book is there's an old Bedouin proverb: me and my brothers against my cousins, me and my cousins against the world. And that's kind of how the U.S. intelligence community will operate from time to time. The British said during the Second World War that of American intelligence, if the Army and Navy, or of the defense industry, if the Navy and Army hadn't been fighting the Germans, they'd be fighting each other. And they very much were fighting each other. Mm-hmm. And so coordination is just one of those key missing pieces where we just never quite get to where we want to be with the intelligence community.
Well, but it's a hard thing to do, and it seems that the policymakers, whether it be the executive branch or the legislative branch, and we'll talk about that, in a second as well, to me, they kind of had almost unrealistic expectations, just to say, okay, hey, we're going to create a policy. Here's a new executive order or whatever. You guys all coordinate and great things are going to happen. And then just kind of, okay, you go in your corner and do your coordination thing, and we're not going to really provide much oversight. It seemed that way, like there was almost unrealistic expectations coming from the leadership that was supposed to craft policy that would better help the coordination happen.
Well, I think you made an even bigger point there, which is, are our expectations of intelligence realistic in the first place? I alluded to two of them, 9/11 and Pearl Harbor. And, I lay out in the book why what we often say are intelligence failures aren't exactly intelligence failures. Mm-hmm. There's a truism that we talk about in intelligence studies, which is there's no such thing as policy failures, only intelligence failures. And that tends to be the case. One thing that I found is at any particular point in time, we have the intelligence system we bargained for. What I mean by that is one of the reasons why we haven't had coordination at key points in time is because we didn't really want the intelligence community to coordinate that well. As Americans, nothing would be a greater threat to liberty than, these secret organizations that conspired in the dark together. So there's a lot of biases against intelligence already in place. And then, the other point on intelligence failure is we accuse the intelligence community of failures when they don't predict the exact time and place. Who, what, when, why, where, how. Every single question has to be answered perfectly, when really a lot of times what I found with American intelligence is it's pretty good at giving you trends and saying, hey, things are heading in this direction, but that's not what policymakers want. They want the exact specifics. And so then when they can't get those specifics, they say, well, intelligence failed. And so you're absolutely right. Part of the problem is our own expectations for intelligence.
Yeah, you talk about that in the book too, that in 9/11, for example, there was plenty of indicators that something was brewing along those lines. But what the policymakers wanted, that is exactly at 8:58 on the morning of September 11th, this is what's going to, at this exact place, at Tower Number 1, that's what they were, in hindsight, that's what they said they should have expected. And it's almost an unrealistic expectation. It's funny you talk about, I always used to say, the shuns are hard, and people do the shuns, like, yeah, coordination, synchronization, cooperation. Shuns are hard. Nobody likes doing the shuns, but the intelligence community was basically directed to do the shuns for, well, the history of intelligence, basically. And you sketch that out very, very strongly in the book. Another theme you see throughout our intelligence history is that tension. Sometimes beneath the surface, sometimes right out there in public, between the executive and the legislative branches of government and the oversight. People talk about, the conflict between President Trump and Congress, which some would call unprecedented. And you use that, you say that frequently, unprecedented. But in reality, it's not unprecedented. Can you kind of talk to that? Sure.
And, historians always, if you challenge them and say something's unprecedented, they're going to do their best to find something
challenge accepted.
Close. Exactly. And so I'm the same way. So I use the term unprecedented too, but I use it carefully. I might even use it in this conversation. We'll see. But, you're absolutely right. And so I identify that tension. And, for instance, when we teach, like when I taught at the Naval War College, we talked about the invitation to struggle with the U.S. Constitution, that by dividing the constitutional prerogatives between the executive, the legislative, the judicial branches over, for instance, the military, you're inviting them to struggle over control of those institutions. Here's the challenge, though, with intelligence. It's not in the Constitution at all. I think that was by design. First of all, why would you put something secret like that in the Constitution? But secondly, again, I already mentioned the bias against intelligence. And so the founders, they had enough problems on their plate getting the Constitution ratified. And there was enough controversy over the military clauses in the Constitution when you look at civil military relations in the history. So if those debates were already bad enough and you're just trying to get the Constitution done, you absolutely don't want to introduce intelligence, both in terms of what the disagreement would be in the Constitutional Convention and then trying to pass it through American civil society at the time. So that's difficult enough. What it means is there's no roadmap really for intelligence. And so the US government kind of had to struggle through the process. And one of the things that I try and point out is the different places where you saw the tug of war between especially the president and Congress over intelligence. And, at least the way it started out, and this is probably due to George Washington being initially a very unifying figure, there was a lot of deference given to him by the Congress. And, he was the president above politics. Well, by the end of his first term, even, it was beginning to fall apart as the modern political party system evolved, the first party system evolved. But pretty much ever since him, Congress and the president have found ways to disagree over how much control of intelligence is given between the executive and the legislative branches. So, as we talked about, how do you write a history of American intelligence? Well, you have to have themes. And so one of the themes is how that tension between the president and Congress has affected the performance of the intelligence community, how it's been structured and organized, and then, how American civil society relates to it. And you pointed out one great way, which is the politicization of intelligence and how it's presented to us between, a president and members of Congress and based on party politics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think that, people will, talk about the current administration and say, oh, President Trump just wants all the power for himself. And, outside of intelligence, that's a different discussion. But I think, your book points it out through the history. Presidents have most of the time really sought to keep oversight of the intelligence community and the intelligence output to themselves. And in fact, have quite actively hidden stuff, knowing they were doing it, hidden stuff from Congress, and not just presidents. You look back at, well, he was more of an imperial president. Presidents throughout history, like you said, going back to the father of the nation, George Washington, and some pretty extreme examples in your book that you cite as well.
That's right. And, just to even start at that foundational period, before the U.S. was a country, the Continental Congress during the Revolutionary War initially created secret committees, and one was called the Committee of Secret Correspondence. It was sort of like an early intelligence overseer. And very quickly, the members of it, including very famous Benjamin Franklin, said, we can't share what we're doing with Congress. Congress can't keep a secret. And then
glad that's changed, right? That's changed.
Exactly. Right. Yeah.
Completely different now, right?
Right. Everyone can keep a secret. And that's, something I always ask audiences is, who can keep a secret? And some people raise their hand and I'm like, really? You're not the person who says to your best friend in the world or your partner or something, hey, I'm going to tell you something, but you can't tell anyone else. Well, you just shared the secret. So, that's happened since the beginning. And, as I alluded to the Constitution and writing it in the Federalist Papers, one of the things that they were wrestling with is, and this is where intelligence sort of fits in, is control of foreign policy. And Hamilton writes in one piece, it's better when it comes to, sensitive foreign affairs that it goes under one person than a large body. And that's been true anyways. I mean, it just kind of makes sense. Like, how do you keep secrets? The more people you tell, the less secrets it's going to stay. But in terms of the wrestling between Congress and the president, as you said, it's not even controversial presidents. It's, some of the presidents who we hold in the highest regard. Abraham Lincoln. I was just at the FDR Reading Festival, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Reagan, people who spoke in the most lofty terms about American principles and transparency, did a lot behind the scenes with intelligence and tried to keep it from Congress or as many other people as they could.
And from the American people as well, which to a certain extent it needs to be. But then your book, and I think a theme running through your book is there needs to be some level of knowledge and recognition by the American people. I mean, we are a government, we're a republic, governed for the people, by the people, for the people. So the people need to have some level of ability to understand. Again, there need to be some secrets. Some official secrets are the right thing to do, and we'll talk more about that balance as well, which is always very challenging. I guess too, obviously a single person keeping a secret is easier, but then that places an enormous trust in that single individual. And you hearken back to George Washington, who had that gravitas, but we elect our presidents, but can we really trust them that much to hold that by themselves, that level of knowledge and capability without some level of sharing?
And that's why, another thing that I tried to do in the book to make it more accessible to readers is something that, to my knowledge, hasn't really been done with intelligence history. And it's something historians like to do, and that's chronologize it. In other words, can we look for eras of intelligence history? And so one of the things I talk about is I sort of break the book down into 4 pieces. And what we're talking about now, as far as the initial wrestling between the president and Congress, in the first period from roughly the start of the United States to the Civil War, intelligence was very much under the president. And there was something called the Secret Service Fund, and it allowed the president to basically pay for spies and intelligence activities without reporting the details back to Congress. But then with the Civil War, and you alluded to this, it's too great to manage. I mean, Abraham Lincoln, if you read Supreme Command by Elliot Cohen, he was a micromanager, but the intelligence responsibilities even were too great.
Yeah.
And so you see the War Department, the Navy Department, the State Department really start to sort of take over. And so now, intelligence control is shifting away from the president into these big executive departments. And then that becomes a problem because, as we talked about, they don't always cooperate well. And so coordination becomes an issue and secrecy becomes an issue because they're keeping secrets from each other and then keeping secrets from the president and then keeping secrets from the American people. So, those silos of excellence we talk about are forming. And that's why the CIA comes along. There's a lot of debate from the First World War through the Second World War. How do you coordinate this thing? Well, the Central Intelligence Agency and a director of Central Intelligence was supposed to do it. And sure enough, we create even more organizations during the Cold War. They don't always coordinate or cooperate. And so, even by the end of the Cold War, we're still struggling with coordination and secrecy and silos and control and the battle for control, not just between the president and Congress, but between different departments and intelligence organizations over their own piece of this massive pie. So, again, it's important for readers to be able to link this history together, identify key themes, reoccurring controversies and tensions, and read some cool spy stories along the way.
Absolutely. It's all packaged together very nicely. Another theme, and you started to approach it, so let's carry it to the next step, was that desire to create a director of national intelligence, that single unifying figure, single point of contact, and oversee the intelligence community, coordinate their efforts. Finally comes to fruition after 9/11, because the mood of the country was, and you talk about in your book how the mood of the country does impact how the level of security that they're willing to accept. But now we're seeing DNI sidelined to a certain extent when her assessment of Iran's nuclear capability didn't align with the president's, to the point the president, I don't care what she's saying. And then he seemed to be relying more on back to the director of Central Intelligence instead of DNI. Is a truly empowered DNI even possible?
Oh, great question. Under the conditions that we have the intelligence community today, I would say no. And this was the debate. So the irony is the DCI, Director of Central Intelligence, now we call them the Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, but the DCI created even before the CIA is created. And within about 10 years, so even by the 1950s, CIA is created in 1947. And at the head of it, you have the DCI, the Director of Central Intelligence. But the DCI has 2 roles: lead the Central Intelligence Agency and coordinate the intelligence community. By the mid-50s, it was already clear, well, you can't exactly do both. And it's sort of unfair. You're going to lead the intelligence community and have control over an intelligence agency. So your bias is probably going to be with the agency. So that kind of depended on whether the DCI came from the CIA or not. But by the 1970s, there was something called the Schlesinger Report. James Schlesinger, who was appointed by Nixon kind of to be an axeman, actually, at the CIA, he goes in and studies the intelligence community and says, one option, even though they reject this, is why don't we create a director of national intelligence? So this is 30 years before the U.S. actually did. And then every decade from that point on, a DNI was proposed in Congress. Now, who typically spoiled it? Well, the Department of Defense, because the Secretary of Defense would have a lot to lose, and the Director of Central Intelligence. So when we create the DNI, there's a couple key problems. And first of all, so we create a director of national intelligence. What happens to the director of central intelligence? Well, yes, they become the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, but the system has been geared towards thinking of that person as so pivotal. And, there's still a tremendous amount of analysis done by the CIA today, even in cooperation with the DNI. So the president has two intelligence advisors to choose from. Mm-hmm. And especially when they both sit in the cabinet, you can choose from your DNI or your DCIA. And if you don't like what one says, you're probably going to go with what the other says. But that goes to a bigger problem with the system as it's designed. As I'd mentioned, so we have different departments and they have different intelligence organizations underneath them. And the ODNI, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and the CIA are the only independent organizations. So the DNI is sort of left hanging there with no true departmental control, like the Secretary of Defense. The Secretary of Defense, top of the DoD. The DNI is sort of in this coordination role at the top of the intelligence community, but not really in charge of it and can't order organizations to do things like, NSA, provide me this intelligence. The NSA is under the DoD. So the Secretary of Defense can weigh in and sort of cut in. So, one thing that they had talked about when they proposed a DNI was, should there be a Department of Intelligence? Well, now you're giving that person, like secretarial position, real authority over different intelligence organizations. And, it's worth considering. It doesn't mean it's worth implementing, but it's worth considering if we feel like the DNI doesn't have enough power, or we're not getting enough out of the DNI doesn't have enough authority. How do you give the DNI enough authority? And do we even want that? Do we want a super intelligence department in this country? That goes back to the American people.
Yeah, no, that's in that. Again, as we come to the end of this podcast, we definitely want to talk about that, just that tension between the American people and spycraft and surveillance and things like that. But for now, let's turn. So obviously, the Middle East is does the Middle East ever really leave the front page of the news? It kind of waxes and wanes a little. It's definitely above the fold, shall we say?
Right.
No question about that. But intelligence estimates in the Middle East and Iran in particular, they're very pertinent right now. And some listeners, probably most of them, recall how intelligence estimates of weapons of mass destruction was a big driver behind what the U.S. did with Iraq in 2003. And the intelligence community you already talked about, they sometimes get the bad rap for bad intel, sometimes fairly, but often unfairly, and often driven for political reasons, not the intel community being political, but the politics around them, especially Congress not wanting to take the blame for their own failures and pushing that down to the intelligence community. So there's kind of two questions in there, talk about both Iran and also the intelligence community getting the bad rap. Can you kind of talk to that, though?
Sure. And this is fascinating. It's useful in some ways to use the Iraqi WMD example and then not useful in others. In other words, there's similarities and differences. So one of the similarities is this is being heavily politicized. One of the debates about even striking Iran in the first place was when the DNI, Tulsi Gabbard, testified before Congress. Since 2003, Iran has not intended to develop a nuclear weapon. It doesn't have the intention to develop a nuclear weapon. The leadership has said, we're not working on a nuclear weapons program. But that only speaks to intentions, because the other issue, when you follow off the ODNI and you follow intelligence community assessments, is you can see that Iran has advanced its nuclear program. So its capabilities have advanced. And, this is where we have to be careful about how people use intelligence, because you can both be right and wrong at the same time. Meaning it's fair to say, well, Iran it has no intention, as far as we know, is developing a nuclear weapon. But then why are you enriching uranium? Are you actually working on weapon systems, for instance, large intercontinental ballistic missiles that could be fitted with nuclear weapons? And so I strongly do believe that the intelligence community does need to be more transparent or speak more directly to the American people. And it has to be careful, of course, because it's under the executive branch. But when there's so much politicization between Congress and the executive, within the executive branch itself, between isolationists and interventionists in the press and in public opinion, we need to be clear about what the intelligence community was saying and not saying. And the other problem with that is, so you have this distinction between intentions and capabilities. And so how do you assess that? And then also, the intelligence community will say things and it'll use a confidence assessment. So it'll say, we have low confidence, which basically means no confidence. Or we have moderate confidence, which means it's a coin toss. Or we have high confidence, which means, we're pretty darn sure. So the problem, though, is they use those confidence or this estimative language, as they call it, but they don't really translate it. And so we actually just saw this with this DIA assessment that said Iran, the nuclear program's only been set back months, but it was low confidence, which means virtually no confidence. It's not even worth leaking at this point, to be perfectly honest. So I would imagine the leak was done for political purposes. And, to go back, though, to the intelligence community and its responsibility. So how do you speak in this plain language? DCIA Ratcliffe, John Ratcliffe, gave, apparently behind closed doors, but I think, this is kind of an analogy that all Americans can relate to. He kind of tied intelligence and capabilities to intentions and capabilities with Iran and intelligence together and compared it to a football game. He said, why would Iran carry its nuclear program all the way to the 1 yard line to not score a touchdown, meaning to develop a nuclear weapon? Now, whether you would agree or disagree with the assessment, remember it's an assessment. I like the plain language there. And it kind of tells you like, that's a great way to translate an intelligence assessment and then, your own analysis of it.
That's something the American people can understand.
That's right.
We're a football crazy country, Now in Europe, not so much. We go, no, we don't understand that. Right. Soccer, they don't understand
Next
that.
Next up, baseball.
Exactly, yeah. Does it go back to people? I mean, like you talked about, and a lot of times it's their assessments. They're not specifics. It's not Iran is going to develop a nuclear weapon at 8:02 a.m. on the morning of, whatever date or, it's. Does it seem like that goes into it too? Is that the policymakers want a level of specifics that just are not going to come with, regardless of the level of confidence in it. It's just not going to come with those specifics. And does that still then drive a politicization of the intelligence to say, okay, so this has some wiggle room I can use to my advantage instead of using it for the reason it's provided, which is informative towards policymaking?
Absolutely. An intelligence analyst, so we often talk in intelligence studies about the relationship between the analyst and the policymaker. And there's cultural differences. Policymakers are confident. I mean, you sort of have to be to run for office and be in the public eye. And they expect confidence and they want it. That also means, though, that they'll look at their analyst and want the analyst. They'll try and drive the analyst to be like, are you sure? I mean, I can only imagine the agony that, different decision makers suffer when they have to use an intelligence assessment where it's, let's say, moderate confidence, 50-50, and then make a decision based on that. So they're going to try and pull the analyst into giving them the highest confidence they can. Analysts, though, by their own culture, they're going to equivocate. They're going to be like, well, they're going to caveat everything. This is what we know. This is what we don't know. This is what we're unsure of. How far would you go? So there's already a tension there. And then the problem is, as you identified, it's an assessment. And so a policymaker can't go in front of the American people really and over something, especially as big a decision to strike another country or go to war and say, how sure are you? Because once they make the decision, they're going to give the information that does the most to support that decision. And they call that cherry picking intelligence. But, at the end of the day, the problem is policymakers need to make decisions. Intelligence analysts need to give their best judgment, and then they need to accept that the policymaker might not listen to them regardless. This is where, again, the transparency is key. And, we did have congressional investigations into Iraqi WMDs. I'm not sure how many people read the full report as opposed to the 9/11 Commission report, which a lot of people read. I believe in that. Make intelligence accessible. Make intelligence investigations accessible. And my guess is, depending on where things go from here, it's possible that we'll have, an investigation to see just what happened and what we knew. And if we do, I just hope it's translatable to public readers.
Yeah, what you were talking about, that reminded me, you and I were in a meeting yesterday and the gentleman said, intelligence often doesn't provide enough to support operations. And I went up to him after, I said, no, you misspoke that. Because I was a soft operator most of my career. I said, no, you misspoke that. Intelligence often doesn't provide enough to satisfy operations. So, and that's more accurate. Usually intelligence provides a lot of information, but the operators from my perspective, the operators or the policymakers, they always want more. They want that smoking gun.
That's right.
They say, this is what's going to happen, which makes their decision easy. When they have to make decisions in a vacuum, for some policymakers, they don't like doing that.
No.
I mean, you said policymakers, especially, members of Congress, are very confident people. They're not always decisive people, though. I mean, Congress, by its very definition, it's a body of people that, it's not a single person is emerged as a decision maker, but you organize and you have a consensus decision. So they don't like making decisions sometimes.
That's right. And what I'll add on to that is, when you're an elected policymaker, you're very attuned to public sentiment or your constituents. And that's why I'm such a big believer in, intelligence is behind so many of the decisions that have been made in American history. I tell people it's not just a history of American intelligence. It's really, this is U.S. history and the way intelligence has influenced it. And the American people need to understand this, because if they don't, then they could signal policymakers who are making decisions based on intelligence in ways that are unproductive. And so, it's kind of a case for wider public literacy and intelligence.
Yeah. So your book's a history, but you also, and you're deeply involved in current research on current technology and current intelligence, and also, technology is a part of that and the collection trends. So what do you see in there? What concerns you?
So this is where I'm going to start. And maybe it's because I live today. And just like other people who lived when there were new inventions that radically changed the world, use the term unprecedented.
This is the one time you may use it,
the
right?
one time I may use it, right. Yeah. And it's being recorded. So
yes, exactly.
I'll have to answer for this someday with other historians. But, look, I say it when it comes to one of the biggest areas of controversy throughout American intelligence history has been domestic surveillance, spying on American citizens. And the capabilities that the intelligence community has today to listen in, and not just on American citizens, but just tremendous technological power. And since people themselves are so connected to their phones and our life, we share our life now with our electronics. I think everyone who's listening can relate to that. Your life, your buying habits, who you're friends with, your conversations, your personality, everything that makes you you is connected to your phone. And what does intelligence aim to do ultimately, and human intelligence in particular? Penetrate the human mind, get access to the human mind and shape behavior. So what does concern me is how technology is progressing, not just in intelligence, but with humans and their use of it. The ability to collect, which can be a wonderful tool to say, stop a terrorist attack, but under the auspices of doing that, how much power are you giving to the U.S. government? And I don't think the founders, we talked about intelligence not being in the Constitution, they never would have imagined a system in which the government has so much power, and especially to pierce the privacy, which is a true American principle. And so what does worry me today is just, the pace of technological change and how it can be wielded. And we already know how authoritarian states are going to do this. They already are. China's social credit system, Russia using biometrics and censorship and, social media and distortion and disinformation to shape their own countries, never mind ours. But is the United States and our constitutional system truly prepared and equipped to handle where intelligence is taking us? I'm truly worried about that.
And I'm gonna follow that tendril a little bit further, because really the title of your book, and that's what it's about: the spy and the state. And the state is not the president or Congress. The state, by definition, is the American people. So that's what your entire book, I guess that's the mega theme of your book, is the relationship between the intelligence community and the American people. And it's that tension that has always existed between the intelligence community and the American citizenry. Sometimes it's tested. And a lot of times, as you talk about in the book, it waxes and wanes depending on the mood of the country. Post 9/11, people were very much into security. They'd accept a lot of restrictions to their personal liberties or their personal privacy for that security. But that's not something that lasts forever. Can you, as we kind of come to the end of the podcast, can you kind of further reflect on the observations you've seen in that tension, and what can we see in the future?
I'm glad you were able to identify that aspect of the book, and it's something that I just sort of conclude with and always talk about. I conclude the book with it, which is it is not just the spy and the state; it's a history of the spy, the state, and the American people and their relationship, and how the American people's perceptions and prejudices and biases affected intelligence. And one of them that is very clear is, there was I obviously sometimes speak through anecdotes, and one of them was a British general writing to another British general during the Second World War. And what he said is the Americans are a mercurial people. They're either up or down. And that's how we are with intelligence too. We really do swing too much. We talk about a pendulum that swings between liberty and security. We swing too much towards one or the other, depending on how we feel at one point in time. And one of the problems is intelligence can't move that quickly. You can't go from saying, yes, in order to keep us safe, check out my bank account, listen to my phone calls, develop those capabilities. In other words, if the IC doesn't have them, they're going to try and develop them. And then tell them, okay, now I feel safe. Stop doing that. Like switch off that light switch. Intelligence, is all the time. It doesn't know the difference between war and peace. It's pervasive. It has to happen. We have to support it all the time. Mm-hmm. But how do we support it? Not by swinging radically between liberty and security, but by having, I guess, more measured judgment about the uses and limits of intelligence. And I mean uses and limits as far as what it does well, where it has its limitations, what it doesn't do as well. We talked about prediction, for instance, and what are the dangers? And so one of the things that I sort of try and explain to people is if you look at like a heartbeat or like a sine wave that goes up and down, you have these peaks and troughs. Our peaks and troughs are just way too high and low in this country when it comes to intelligence. So when people ask me like, well, how do you fix that? You're never going to get the balance exactly right. It's just a matter of, can we sort of reduce that huge variation between peaks and troughs and just exercise a little better judgment? And what that means ultimately is tolerate a little bit more risk security wise to provide a little bit more liberty to the American people, but also similarly tolerate a little bit more security at the expense of liberty. The problem is we do either too much of one or too much
balance
of the other.
Is hard to strike.
And we're reaching a point, and this is again going back to my concern. I'm worried that we're reaching a point where how intelligence is used, not just in the US, but around the world, and the competition the United States is in today, including the intelligence competition, is we're going to be both less safe and less free. And so our old way of doing things just isn't going to work for the 21st century.
Well, so your book was published, when did it come out again?
June 2nd.
June 2nd. Okay. So just, inside of a month, it just came out. And you're still doing, I know you're doing book talks, book tours, and things like that. Mm-hmm. When's your next one?
I'll be on local news, actually, with Linda Hurtado on Fox 13 in July. And I'll be talking at local, believe it or not, Sanford, Florida. There's a great Civil War story about a guy named Henry Shelton Sanford. He's the namesake of Sanford, Florida. And I did research there. So I'll be up speaking to the good people of Sanford, Florida. And then as universities and colleges get back in session, I'll be doing more speaking up at some of those schools in the north. Everything's north of Florida. So.
Yeah. Do you have a website that some of these things will come out? If somebody wanted to kind of follow, say, we're only scratching the surface of your book with this 30-minute podcast, which we're about to wrap up. But I'm just telling everybody out there, if you want to really dive into this and meet Jeff as well, it'd be well worth your time to come to one of his book talks or even listen to it virtually. But if you can come to one of them, it's really he's excellent in person. Very, as you can tell, very personable. He is a true Florida man as well, born and raised in the Tampa Bay area.
That's right.
So when he's not thinking deep thoughts, you're out on Tampa Bay fishing and,
That's right.
and hauling in a good catch. Is there any way that they'd be able to track where you may be in the future?
Sure. I post on formerly Twitter, now X, and the hashtag is @TheSpyTheState. No and wouldn't fit. Or also I have LinkedIn and I've been doing more there. So yeah, if people are more than welcome to. And, as you said, I do have people reach out, and I love this history. I love talking about it. So when people reach out, I like having the conversation.
Yes, I can vouch for that as well. There's no question about that. Any final thoughts as we wrap up the podcast?
As I sort of write to people and write in the book, the big thing I ask people to talk about or to think about, and it's something that applies beyond intelligence, though, is liberty or security? ? Like, what do you prefer? They exist at opposite ends. A little bit more of one is a little less of the other. So how do you want to balance it? And this is, we're in the Global and National Security Institute. It's something that each of us is always considering when we talk about U.S. national security. And it's the great question for the United States and the American Republic in the 21st century.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a question that probably a lot of American citizens should be considering more and more, and a lot of them probably aren't. But I would say, I would tell everybody, pick up a copy of The Spy in the State, and you can be more informed to make these decisions and be able to contribute to what our policymakers are doing. So our thanks to our own Dr. Jeff Rogg for his brief look at a deep dive into the history of American intelligence. His book, The Spy in the State, The History of American Intelligence, is available now at all your favorite bookstores. We'll have a link in the show notes as well. Next week on At the Boundary, we'll be talking with USF Professor of Communication Josh Scacco, who made history in April as the first USF faculty member to be selected as an Andrew Carnegie Fellow. He's also the founding director of USF Center for Sustainable Democracy. We're going to talk with him about his fellowship, of course, but we're also going to seek his insights into political polarization and its impacts on national security. Thanks for listening today. If you like the podcast, please subscribe and let your friends and colleagues know. And if you have an idea for a future podcast, we'd love to hear from you. There's a link in the show notes to get in touch with us. You can follow GNSI on our LinkedIn and X accounts at USF_GNSI. And check out our website as well at usf.edu/GNSI. While you're there, don't forget to subscribe to our monthly newsletter. That's going to wrap up this episode of At the Boundary. Each new episode will feature global and national security issues we found to be insightful, intriguing, maybe controversial, but overall just worth talking about. I'm Jim Cardoso, and we'll see you at the Boundary.